And potentially one of the most damaging days of the $250 million New York civil fraud trial against Donald Trump. Yesterday, the defense team's own witness, a former Trump Organization executive named Jeffrey McConney, who is a co-defendant in the case, may have provided a direct link between the ex-president and the alleged exaggerations of the value of his properties. According to Business Insider, quote, McConney had been called to the witness stand by the defense, but on cross-examination by lawyers for the state attorney general's office Tuesday, he linked Trump firmly to the conspiracy and fraud counts that have yet to be decided in the non-jury trial. McConney was handed People's Exhibit 3054, a draft of Trump's net worth statement for 2014. He was asked to look at a note scribbled in thin blue ink on the draft's first page, DJT, to get final review, which he said he had written. The AG has alleged the net worth statement that McConney was handed the draft for from 2014 contained $3.5 billion in exaggerations. McConney also broke down in tears on the witness stand, saying that the mounting legal investigations led him to retire from the job after 35 years. Joining our conversation, New York Times investigative reporter Suzanne Craig is back, and with me at the table, MSNBC legal analyst Lisa Rubin and New York Times editorial board member Mara Gay. Susan, how did Jeffrey McConney's testimony read to you?
I mean, it wasn't great. I think in a trial of not a lot of great days for Donald Trump and the Trump Organization. You know, there's a document that's out there. It's as you mentioned, the 2014 statements of financial condition, and right on the top of it, it says DJT to get final review, and it really does tie Trump to the document. We don't know if he got final review, but it shows there was some sort of acknowledgement in the organization that Donald Trump would sign off on these documents. And you know, Donald Trump has really tried to distance himself from this. He has said that he has an army of accountants and lawyers who look at these things. And I always think it's interesting with the Trump Organization, you hear on the one hand, they're a mom and pop organization, very tightly run, you know, from the top down to the point where Donald Trump, up until the time he went to the White House, was signing every check that went out the door. But then you have, when it suits them, they're a large organization and they really don't get into the minutia of things like statements of financial conditions and audits. They rely on others. And the testimony from, I think, Jeff McConney yesterday really did tie the president, at least in some way, the former president in some way, to the financial statements. And that, you know, is significant.
Well, I want to ask you, Lisa, about that. According to Business Insider, the spreadsheet czar had testified on direct examination Monday that he would review each year's draft net worth statement with former Trump Organization CFO Alan Weisselberg, who would then give the approved draft to the outside accounting firm Mazars USA, which would print the final statement. Quote, I believe there was a step in between that involved Donald Trump prior to 2017, state lawyer Andrew said to McConney, who appeared uncomfortable on the stand as he said Trump indeed did the ultimate signing off. McConney's many handwritten notes indicate it was Trump and his top executives who made the last edits and then signed off on these net worth statements. As such, the notes do serious damage to the primary Trump defense. Blame Mazars, blame the accountants. Is this a direct link?
I think it is a direct link, but you don't even need this document of McConney's testimony to get the direct link, because Donald Trump himself gave it to us on November 6th. He was on the stand with Andrew Raymer, who also did the examination yesterday. And he said, is it correct that you had reviewed the statements of financial condition in each of the years from 2011 to 2017 before it became final? And Donald Trump's answer, and I'm reading to you from the transcript, Alicia, is, yeah, I would look at them. So you had it from the horse's mouth. You didn't need Jeff McConney and his handwriting and the Attorney General confronting him with things that put sort of a wrench in the narrative about blame it on Mazars. Donald Trump was willing to admit it himself when he took the stand.
And yet, when we talk about Trump's legal team and the choices that they make, it is noteworthy that they chose, this was their witness. Right. This was their witness who then added, perhaps they did not need it, but added more data points to suggest that Donald Trump indeed knew what he was doing.
Well, one of the other interesting things about the Trump Organization, and this was true in the White House as well, is that we know that Donald Trump chose people around him who were sometimes competent but always loyal. And so, you know, what we're seeing here is that even with a bevy of lawyers whose sole purpose was to protect Donald Trump, whether or not something illegal was going on, there were mistakes made. And in a way, the more cooks you have in a shop, the more complicated that becomes. So the very people who he hired thinking they're going to protect me, they're going to prevent me from putting my own name at risk, actually now may have kind of sealed his fate. And so I do think it makes a difference, at least to the public, to see, Donald Trump to get final approval on this. I mean, it's true. We've heard it out of his mouth. We've seen it. There's a trail there. But there's something that feels different about putting it in writing, because Donald Trump is known for never putting anything in writing. And here it is, plain as day, at the top of the document.
Sometimes competent, always loyal definitely belongs on a mug or on a T-shirt. Susan, I want to read this to you, too, from Business Insider. Quote, in one key cautionary note from the 2015 draft, McConney made a notation in ink that this computation also includes forecasted deals that have not signed yet. In the note, McConney asked whether Trump wanted to exclude some $151 million in as-yet fictional assets from the net worth statement. The final version of that year's net worth statement shows McConney's suggestion was ignored, possibly by Trump himself. The AG alleges that Trump routinely padded out his net worth statements with the same sorts of non-existent assets. Does it speak to the question of Donald Trump's intent?
I think it does. You saw McConney when he testified and was examined by the Attorney General, and he said some of it was mistakes and some of it was oversight, but there were things that were intentional, and I think it does go to intent in what they were doing. These numbers that we hear so much about, whether it's the Manhattan triplex that Donald Trump lived in Trump Tower, was it 10,000 square feet or 30,000 square feet, or is the asset worth 30 million or 300 million. You sort of sometimes think they just pick these numbers out of thin air, but they did try and back them up with things. And this is why, what they were doing behind the scenes and what they were excluding and the inputs that were going in go to their intent. And a lot of the trial is focused on those inputs and whether or not they were valid or not.
Lisa, I want to read you this from the Messenger. In emotional testimony Tuesday morning, McConney rattled off his many legal woes and may have disclosed a new one. He said that he received a subpoena from the Southern District of New York, SDNY, some 2 hours before he was supposed to testify. McConney has been called to testify twice in the civil fraud case and once in the criminal case, and it is unclear before which stint on the witness stand he claims to have received a subpoena. The spokesperson for SDNY said he could not confirm or comment on a subpoena. What does it mean?
Well, first of all, let's go back to what Jeff McConney was saying when he disclosed that. He was saying that he retired because he just wanted to relax and stop participating in these investigations. But the very fact that he was served with that subpoena, as well as his testimony yesterday, demonstrates that Jeff McConney can't escape these investigations, whether or not he is a current or former employee of the Trump enterprise. So, what stock do I put in that? I don't know what the Southern District is investigating, but I can tell you that there is ample room to investigate anything and everything having to do with this organization and its tax and financial improprieties. Jeff McConney famously testified at last year's tax fraud trial where the Trump Organization and Alan Weisselberg were convicted. He's also testified that he himself assisted Alan Weisselberg in that other tax fraud scheme. Why? Because he was afraid he was going to lose his job. So Jeff McConney can get upset and emotional. He might be regretful, but that doesn't mean he wasn't complicit.
Mara, the business brand was sort of foundational to the political brand. I think at this point it's questionable which one has surpassed the other. It would seem, though, that the damage done here, the damage revealed about how this organization was actually running, should tarnish the overall concept that this was some financial genius.
It should. Of course, that's not what's happening. And I think that part of this is, I don't want to call it genius, but I think the magic, the dark magic, really, of Donald Trump, which is his ability to connect with this deep base that he has that may be small, but it runs deep, to say, I'm just like you. You're just like me. And so you don't want to give the government money. Everybody cheats on their taxes. Everybody commits this kind of fraud, and you would do it too if you could. Don't you want to be like me? And I think because of that, and because of the tribalism of Donald Trump's base, it really doesn't hurt him. I do think that there are independents who are turned off by this, that there are moderate Republicans who are turned off by this in swing states. One of the other striking things to me as a New Yorker, a lifelong New Yorker, growing up with Donald Trump as kind of a figure, a tabloid figure, and then, of course, kind of a reality TV figure, and then more an authoritarian figure, is that much of this fraud has gone on for so many decades, and yet it was allowed to go on until he became the president. And in a way you can kind of understand, but another way you say, well, where is the accountability? And I think that Donald Trump has actually benefited from that, because he's saying to Americans in his base, you know what, everybody's a crook anyway, so let me get away with it. And I think that that shouldn't resonate with people, but it does. So it's a little bit demoralizing that there are people out there who say, what's the big deal?